I remember the exact moment my life cracked open. Not shattered, that would come later, but cracked, like ice on a lake in early spring, just enough to let the water beneath start moving again. It was October 23rd, a Saturday evening that smelled of wood smoke and dying leaves. I had turned 44 3 weeks earlier, marking the occasion with dinner at the same restaurant where Evelyn and I always celebrated birthdays, a safe, predictable ritual that had somehow become our default approach to most things. I remember thinking, as I blew out the candles on a slice of chocolate cake I didn't particularly want, that this was what contentment was supposed to feel like. Steady, uncomplicated, enough. The Hartwell barn had been transformed for Sarah and Michael's reception. Strings of warm white lights draped from beam to beam like fallen stars. Candles flickered on every table, casting everything in that forgiving amber glow that makes even the most ordinary faces look touched by magic. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon and cloves from the mulled cider, mixed with the earthy smell of hay bales arranged as makeshift seating around the dance floor. Somewhere in the rafters, strings of autumn leaves rustled in the occasional breeze that snuck through the open barn doors, carrying with it the promise of winter's approach. I had always been drawn to these in-between moments, the pause between seasons, the quiet spaces in conversations, the seconds before important decisions. Tonight felt suspended in time, as if the whole evening existed in one of those pauses, waiting for something to tip it in one direction or another. I stood at the edge of it all, holding a half-empty glass of wine I didn't really want, watching Evelyn laugh with Mrs. Patterson, the bride's mother. My wife of 19 years had her head thrown back, genuinely delighted by something. Probably one of Mrs. Patterson's stories about her late husband's legendary attempts at home improvement. Evelyn's laugh was the same one that had drawn me to her in college, bright and unguarded. I used to live for that sound. She wore a navy blue dress I had complimented that morning, though the words had felt automatic, the kind of husbandly observation that came from years of practice rather than genuine appreciation. Not that the dress wasn't lovely, it was. Not that Evelyn wasn't beautiful. She was, in the comfortable, familiar way of someone whose face you know better than your own reflection. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped really seeing her, stopped being surprised by her, stopped feeling that little spark of recognition that used to hit me when she walked into a room. The band had been playing covers of classic rock and wedding standards for the better part of 2 hours. Couples swayed together on the worn wooden floor, teenage cousins attempted elaborate dance moves near the speakers, and the older guests sat safely at their tables, content to watch and remember their own dancing days. I preferred watching too. I always had. There was something comforting about being the observer rather than the observed, about existing on the periphery where expectations were lower and the risk of exposure was minimal. At school, I spent my days listening to teenagers confess their fears and dreams, helping them navigate the treacherous waters of adolescence, but I had learned to do it from behind the protective barrier of my role. Counselor Desmond. Helpful Desmond. Safe, reliable, utterly predictable Desmond, who never said the wrong thing because he rarely said anything that revealed too much about who he really was. But then the music shifted. The lead singer, a woman with silver hair and a voice like honey over gravel, stepped up to the microphone and announced they were going to try something fun. A couple's dance game, she called it. All the married couples were invited to participate, but here was the twist. They would draw names from 2 hats, mixing everyone up with new partners. I felt my stomach tighten in the way it always did when faced with unexpected social situations. The wine glass in my hand suddenly felt slippery with condensation, or maybe it was my own palm growing damp. I glanced toward the exit, calculating how long it would take me to slip outside for some air, maybe walk around the building once or twice until this particular moment of communal fun had passed. I had perfected the art of strategic disappearance over the years. Bathroom breaks that lasted just long enough. Phone calls that required urgent attention, sudden headaches that necessitated a quiet moment alone. But Evelyn had already spotted me. She was walking over with that particular smile she wore when she was about to volunteer us for something I would rather avoid. She said we should participate. It would be fun, she said. When was the last time we danced together, really danced? She asked. I couldn't remember, which seemed to prove her point. Before I could formulate a reasonable excuse, she had taken my wine glass and nudged me toward the makeshift stage where the singer was holding two decorated mason jars. One for the women, one for the men. I watched as hands reached in, unfolding slips of paper, calling out names. There was laughter, mock protests, good-natured groaning as spouses found themselves separated and strangers were brought together. I reached into the men's jar without thinking, my fingers closing around a piece of paper that felt impossibly significant given what it was, just someone's name scrawled in blue ink. I unfolded it slowly, stalling. Ellis Brennan. The name meant nothing to me, but somehow the way it was written, clear, confident handwriting that leaned slightly to the right, suggested someone who knew himself, who didn't second-guess his thoughts before committing them to paper. I looked around, not recognizing the name, until a man near the bar raised his hand. He was tall, probably close to my age, with dark hair going gray at the temples and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a simple blue button-down shirt and dark jeans. Nothing remarkable, but something about the way he carried himself caught my attention. There was a quietness to him, a stillness that stood out in the bustling barn. When our eyes met across the room, he smiled. Not the performative wedding smile that everyone wore tonight, but something smaller, more genuine, almost apologetic. We met in the center of the dance floor along with a dozen other unlikely pairs. He extended his hand and I took it, his palm warm and slightly rough with calluses. When he introduced himself, his voice was low and steady. He said he was sorry I'd gotten stuck with him. He wasn't much of a dancer. I told him that made two of us. The singer announced the song, an old Carole King number, something slow and sweet that my mother used to hum while doing dishes. The couples around us began to move, some gracefully, others with the charming awkwardness of people dancing with strangers at weddings. Ellis stepped closer, his right hand finding the small of my back, his left hand taking mine in a loose, comfortable grip. The contact was warm, deliberate without being presumptuous. He moved carefully, leading without insistence, and I found myself following easily. We weren't dancing so much as swaying, finding a rhythm that felt natural despite the strangeness of the situation. I had expected to feel awkward, to count the seconds until the song ended. Instead, I found myself noticing things I usually filtered out, the way the candlelight caught the laugh lines around Ellis's eyes, how his shirt smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, the surprising steadiness of his hand against my back. Most people, when forced into these social interactions, perform them while mentally elsewhere. Ellis seemed entirely present, as if this moment, this random dance with a stranger at someone else's wedding, deserved his full attention. He asked what I did for work. I told him I was a counselor at the high school. He nodded and said that must be rewarding but challenging. Most people said something generic about dealing with teenagers, but Ellis seemed to understand the weight of it, the way you carry pieces of other people's stories home with you, how you learn to hide your own struggles while helping others navigate theirs. He said he had been a therapist himself, briefly, before switching to teaching woodworking. He understood the particular exhaustion that comes from being everyone else's safe harbor while never quite finding your own. The song was nearly over when something shifted. Maybe it was the way the candlelight caught the silver in his hair, or how his thumb brushed across my knuckles as we turned. Maybe it was simply that he didn't let go when he could have, didn't step back when the space between us grew smaller. But something in my chest began to flutter, like a bird that had been sleeping for years suddenly stretching its wings. For a moment that couldn't have lasted more than a few seconds, but felt much longer, I allowed myself to imagine what it would be like to be held like this by choice rather than circumstance. To be seen by someone who looked at me the way Ellis was looking at me now, with curiosity, with kindness, with something that might have been recognition. When the music ended, Ellis held on for just a moment longer than necessary before releasing my hand. He thanked me for the dance, said it had been a pleasure. His eyes lingered on mine for a heartbeat too long, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks that had nothing to do with the wine or the warm barn air. I made my way back to our table where Evelyn was already waiting, her face bright with curiosity. She asked if I'd had fun, if Ellis seemed nice. I heard myself saying yes, absolutely, while my mind replayed the feeling of his hand against my spine, the way his voice had gotten quieter when the music swelled, how solid and real he had felt when the rest of the evening seemed like performance. I spent the rest of the reception stealing glances across the room, watching Ellis talk quietly with other guests, noting how he listened more than he spoke, how he seemed comfortable in his own skin in a way I envied. When he left, he caught my eye across the crowded barn and raised his hand in a small wave. I waved back, my heart beating faster than it should have. During the drive back to our hotel, Evelyn chattered about the evening. Wasn't the bride beautiful? Wasn't the food delicious? Wasn't it sweet how the groom's grandfather had insisted on giving a toast despite his obvious nervousness? I made appropriate responses, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying those few minutes on the dance floor like a song stuck on repeat. Our hotel room was small and generic, the kind of place that exists solely for wedding guests and highway travelers. Evelyn brushed her teeth and washed her face with the efficient movements of someone comfortable in her routines. She talked about tomorrow's plans, brunch with my sister, the long drive home, what we needed to pick up from the grocery store. Normal, domestic concerns that usually grounded me, but tonight felt impossibly distant. I went through my own nighttime routine on autopilot, brushing teeth, changing into pajamas, checking that my phone was charging on the nightstand. But every movement felt strange, as if I was watching someone else perform the familiar rituals of my life. The man who had dressed for this wedding that morning seemed like a different person entirely, someone who hadn't yet learned that 3 minutes and 47 seconds could reorganize the architecture of everything he thought he knew about himself. She fell asleep quickly, the way she always did, her breathing evening out into the soft rhythm I'd grown accustomed to over nearly 2 decades. I lay beside her in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my body still somehow holding the memory of Ellis's touch. I told myself it was nothing, a moment of connection with a stranger, the kind of brief intimacy that happens at weddings when the music is soft and the lights are low and everyone is thinking about love in its various forms. But I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at me, like he was seeing something I kept hidden even from myself. I couldn't stop remembering how right it had felt to be held by him, how natural and unforced, in a way that made me realize how long it had been since I'd felt truly seen by another person. How long it had been since I'd felt like anything more than the sum of my roles: husband, father, counselor, neighbor, all the ways I had learned to exist without ever quite learning to live. I rolled onto my side, watching Evelyn sleep, her face peaceful and familiar. She deserved better than a husband who lay awake thinking about dancing with strangers. She deserved someone who came home to her completely, without reservation, without the feeling that part of him was always somewhere else, waiting for something he couldn't name. But even as I thought this, I knew it wasn't entirely fair. The distance between us hadn't appeared overnight, and it wasn't entirely my fault. We had both retreated into the safety of routine, the comfortable numbness of a marriage that functioned perfectly well on the surface while slowly hollowing out underneath. We were both guilty of choosing ease over intimacy, of building a life that looked right from the outside while feeling increasingly empty from within. The digital clock on the nightstand clicked over to 2:30 in the morning, then 3, then 4. Outside, I could hear the occasional car passing on the highway, carrying other people toward their own lives, their own complicated truths. I thought about the version of myself who had woken up that morning, who had driven to this wedding with no expectation of anything more significant than mediocre chicken and predictable speeches. That version of me felt like a stranger now, someone I had been pretending to be for so long, I had almost convinced myself it was real. But lying there in the dark, listening to my wife breathe and remembering the warmth of another man's hand against my back, I understood that something fundamental had shifted during those 3 minutes and 47 seconds of a Carole King song. A door had opened that I couldn't close again, and the man I had been before Ellis Brennan took my hand was already becoming a memory. The hardest part wasn't admitting that something had happened. The hardest part was acknowledging how much I wanted it to happen again. The drive home from the wedding took 3 hours, and I spent most of it staring out the passenger window while Evelyn navigated the winding Connecticut back roads that led to our small town of Millfield. She had insisted on driving, claiming I looked tired, and I didn't argue. The truth was, I felt hollowed out, like someone had reached inside my chest and rearranged everything while I wasn't paying attention. Evelyn filled the silence with observations about the ceremony, the food, the interesting people we'd met. She mentioned Ellis briefly. What a nice man he seemed, so polite during the dance. I made appropriate sounds of agreement while watching the autumn landscape blur past, gold and red leaves spiraling down from trees that lined the road like sentries. Every few minutes, I caught myself replaying the feeling of his hand against my back, the way he had looked directly into my eyes when he spoke, how solid and real he had felt in a world that suddenly seemed made of tissue paper. We pulled into our driveway at 7:15 on Sunday evening, the sky already deepening toward dusk. Our house sat at the end of Maple Street like a bookmark in a familiar story. White clapboard siding that needed painting, green shutters that had faded to the color of old sage, a wraparound porch where a swing hung motionless in the still air. I had been meaning to fix the loose board on the front steps for 2 years now, along with the gutter that pulled away from the house during last winter's ice storm. These small failures of maintenance had become a running joke between Evelyn and me, though lately they felt less amusing and more like evidence of some deeper negligence I couldn't quite name. Owen's car was in the driveway, a dented Honda Civic he had bought with money from his summer job at the hardware store. At 17, he was all elbows and earnestness, captain of the debate team and bound for college in less than a year. Fiona, 15 and fierce, would be upstairs doing homework while listening to music I pretended not to understand. The normalcy of it should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like putting on clothes that no longer fit properly. Monday morning arrived with the particular crispness of late October, the kind of day that demanded coffee and wool sweaters and the resigned acceptance that summer was truly finished. I woke at 5:30, as I had every weekday for the past 15 years, and went through the ritual of making coffee while the house slept around me. The kitchen was painted yellow, a color Evelyn had chosen when we first moved in because she said it would make the mornings feel less dark. It had worked, mostly, though now the cheerful walls seemed to mock the gray mood that had settled over me like fog. I stood at the counter waiting for the coffee to brew, watching through the window as Mrs. Henderson walked her ancient beagle past our house. She waved, and I waved back, both of us playing our parts in the small-town theater of polite acknowledgement. Everyone knew everyone in Millfield, their stories, their struggles, their carefully maintained facades. I was Desmond Clark, the high school counselor who had married his college sweetheart and built a quiet, respectable life. Reliable Desmond. Steady Desmond. The man parents trusted with their troubled teenagers, who never missed a PTA meeting or forgot to vote in local elections. But standing there in my yellow kitchen, still wearing the pajamas Evelyn had given me last Christmas, I felt like an actor who had forgotten his lines. The high school where I worked was a brick building from the 1960s, the kind of institutional architecture that prioritized function over beauty. My office was on the second floor, down a hallway lined with lockers that clanged and rattled between classes. The walls were painted that particular shade of institutional green that existed nowhere in nature, and my desk sat beneath a window that looked out over the parking lot and, beyond that, the maple trees that gave our town its name. On my desk sat a framed photograph from our wedding day. Evelyn and me standing on the steps of the church, both of us young and bright-eyed, and convinced we had figured out the secret to happiness. Her dress was simple but elegant, my suit borrowed from my father. We were smiling with the particular intensity of people who believe their love could overcome anything. Looking at that photograph now, I could see the hope in our faces, but also something else, a kind of performance, as if we were already playing the roles of happy couple rather than simply being one. The morning passed in its usual rhythm of appointments and crises. Tommy Rodriguez came in crying because his girlfriend had broken up with him via text message. Sarah Chin needed help navigating the college application process, while her parents pressured her to choose pre-med over art. Marcus Thompson, a senior who towered over me by 6 inches, sat in the chair across from my desk and quietly confessed that he thought he might be failing chemistry but was too embarrassed to ask for help. I listened, offered advice, made phone calls, filled out forms. This was what I was good at, creating safe spaces for other people's truths, helping them find words for feelings they didn't understand. But as the day wore on, I found myself distracted by memories of Saturday night, by the way Ellis had smiled when the song ended, by the realization that I had never felt as present in my own life as I had during those few minutes on the dance floor. After school, I drove through downtown Millfield on my way home, past the pharmacy where old Mr. Santos still mixed prescriptions by hand, past the diner where teenagers gathered after football games, past the small park where Evelyn and I used to bring Owen and Fiona when they were little. The familiarity of it all should have been soothing. Instead, I felt like I was seeing it through glass, like someone visiting a museum exhibit of a life I used to live. Tuesday brought parent-teacher conferences, and I spent the evening at school listening to mothers and fathers worry about their children's futures. The Johnsons were concerned about their son's sudden interest in theater instead of football. The Martinezes wanted to know if their daughter was really college material or if they should start looking at trade schools. I nodded, took notes, offered reassurance and practical advice, all while feeling like a fraud. How could I help other people navigate their children's authentic selves when I was still figuring out my own? Wednesday evening, Evelyn went to her book club, and I found myself alone in the house for the first time since the wedding. Owen was at debate practice. Fiona was at her friend's house working on a group project. I stood in the living room listening to the silence, then walked upstairs to our bedroom and opened the closet. My clothes hung in neat rows, button-down shirts in blue and white, and the occasional pale green, khakis and dark jeans, 2 suits for weddings and funerals and parent meetings. Everything clean, pressed, appropriate. I reached out and touched one of the shirts, remembering suddenly how Ellis had looked in his simple blue button-down, how comfortable he had seemed in his own skin. When was the last time I had felt comfortable in mine? I pulled out a box from the top shelf, one I hadn't opened in years. Inside were remnants of my college years, old notebooks, ticket stubs, photographs of friends whose names I could barely remember. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was a journal I had kept during my junior year. I opened it carefully, the pages yellow and brittle, and began to read. The entries were mundane mostly, complaints about professors, excitement about upcoming exams, observations about campus life. But scattered throughout were other things, thoughts I had forgotten I'd ever written down. A description of my roommate David, how he looked when he studied late at night, the light from his desk lamp catching the curve of his jaw. A confession about a dream I'd had, one that left me confused and ashamed when I woke up. An entry from spring break when most of our friends had gone to Florida, and David and I had stayed behind, spending long evenings talking about books and life and futures we couldn't quite imagine. I had written about almost kissing him one night, how we had been sitting on his bed looking at photographs from high school, and something in the air had shifted, become charged with possibility. How I had leaned closer, and he had turned toward me, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, anything could have happened. But then someone had knocked on our door, and the moment shattered, and we never spoke of it again. Reading those words now, 23 years later, I felt something unlock in my chest. Not shame, exactly, but recognition. The seeds of this moment had been there all along, buried under years of careful choices and deliberate blindness. Thursday at work, I found myself paying attention to things I usually filtered out. The way Jake Morrison, one of our English teachers, looked when he talked about his weekend plans with his boyfriend. The easy intimacy between them that he mentioned casually. The way he spoke about love without apology or explanation. I had always liked Jake, admired his intelligence and his way with difficult students, but I had never really seen him before. Now I watched him during faculty meetings, noticed how he carried himself with a quiet confidence that I envied. Friday evening, I volunteered at the food pantry as I did every week, sorting donations and helping families carry groceries to their cars. Mrs. Kowalski, who ran the operation with military efficiency, assigned me to work alongside Tom Brady, not the football player, but a local carpenter who had been volunteering here longer than anyone could remember. Tom was in his 50s, divorced, with calloused hands and a gentle way of talking to the children who came in with their parents. We worked in comfortable silence for most of the evening, organizing canned goods and checking expiration dates. But as we were cleaning up, Tom mentioned that he was heading to Hartford for the weekend to visit friends. Something in the way he said it, friends, with a particular emphasis, made me look at him more closely. He met my eyes and smiled, a smile that held knowledge and maybe a little sadness. I wanted to ask him something, though I wasn't sure what. About how he had figured out who he was, maybe. About how he lived authentically in a town like ours. About whether it was possible to change the trajectory of a life that had been moving in the same direction for so long. But I didn't know how to form those questions, and the moment passed. Walking to my car afterward, I realized I had been holding my breath for days, maybe years. The dance with Ellis had been like taking a deep breath after a lifetime of shallow breathing, and now I couldn't figure out how to go back to the way things were before. At home, I found Evelyn grading papers at the kitchen table, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, a cup of tea growing cold beside her elbow. She looked up when I came in and asked how the food pantry had been. I told her it was fine, the usual, nothing noteworthy. She nodded and returned to her papers, and I stood there for a moment watching her. This woman who had loved me faithfully for 2 decades, wondering if she had ever suspected that the man she married was not quite the man she thought he was. That night, lying in bed beside her, I stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine a different version of my life. One where I had been braver at 21, where I had leaned in and kissed David that night instead of pulling away, where I had chosen honesty over safety, authenticity over acceptance. But every alternate path I imagined led back to the same question. Who would I be if I stopped pretending to be someone else? The house settled around us with its familiar creaks and sighs, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of a train heading toward Hartford, toward places where people like Tom Brady went to visit friends, toward a world where men danced together not because their names were drawn from a hat, but because they chose to. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but all I could think about was the warmth of Ellis's hand against my back, and how much I wanted to feel that alive again. The weekend brought its own rituals. Saturday morning, I drove Owen to his job at Henderson's Hardware, where he stocked shelves and learned about responsibility from Mr. Henderson, who had been running the store since before I was born. On the drive, Owen talked about college applications, about whether he should apply early decision to his first choice or keep his options open. He was methodical about everything. My son, he had charts and spreadsheets for his college search, color-coded folders for each application. Listening to him plan his future with such clarity made me acutely aware of how I had never really planned mine, how I had simply drifted from one expected milestone to the next. When he asked for my advice about his personal essay, I found myself struggling to find words. He wanted to write about overcoming obstacles, about growth and discovery. Semester of junior year that stopped me cold. I'd written about a party where David and I had ended up on the roof of our dormitory, talking until dawn about books and music and the futures we couldn't quite imagine. How the conversation had grown quiet as the sun came up. How we'd moved closer together without discussing it. How for one perfect, terrifying moment, I thought he might kiss me. But then people had started moving around downstairs, getting ready for early classes, and the moment had dissolved. I'd written about the relief I'd felt, but also about a sadness I couldn't explain. How I'd spent the rest of the semester finding reasons to avoid being alone with David. How our friendship had gradually shifted into something safer and less intense. The journal entry ended with a question I'd apparently been unable to answer at the time. Why does the thought of loving him feel both impossible and inevitable? I closed the notebook and sat there in our dining room, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of my younger self's confusion, and understood that the questions I'd been asking myself since that wedding dance weren't new. They were old questions that I'd successfully avoided answering for more than 2 decades. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay beside Evelyn, listening to her steady breathing and thinking about that boy on the rooftop, about David's face in the dawn light, about all the moments of potential I'd talked myself out of because they felt too dangerous to pursue. At the community center the following Thursday, I worked with Marcus on college applications while stealing glances at Ellis as he demonstrated proper sanding technique to another student. There was something hypnotic about watching him work, the way he moved with complete confidence, the gentle corrections he offered, the satisfaction that crossed his face when a student grasped a new concept. After the session ended and the other mentors had left, Ellis and I found ourselves alone in the workshop, cleaning tools and organizing materials for the next week. The radio played softly from a corner shelf classic rock that had probably been popular when we were in college, songs that carried the weight of decades and the ache of nostalgia. Ellis asked how I thought Marcus was progressing, and I told him about the breakthrough we'd had that evening with his college essay. But then, without planning it, I found myself talking about my own college years, about the confusion and certainty that had seemed to exist side by side in those days. I told him about David. Not everything, but enough. About how close we'd been, about the moments that had felt charged with possibility, about the night on the rooftop when something had almost happened. About how I'd spent years telling myself it had been nothing more than intense friendship, but how recent events had made me question that convenient interpretation. Ellis listened without interrupting, his hands continuing to work while his attention remained focused on my words. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and I worried that I'd revealed too much, crossed some line from professional collaboration into inappropriate confession. But then he said something that made my chest tighten with recognition. He said he understood, that he'd had similar friendships in college, similar moments of almost. That the difference between what we called friendship and what we called love was sometimes just a matter of courage, of being willing to name what we actually felt rather than what we thought we were supposed to feel. The conversation continued as we moved through the workshop, putting away tools and turning off lights. Ellis told me about his own version of David, a boy named James who had been his roommate senior year, who had challenged him and comforted him, and made him feel seen in ways that felt both natural and revolutionary. How they developed a relationship that existed in the spaces between categories, too intimate to be casual friendship but too frightening to acknowledge as anything more. What happened to him? I asked. Ellis smiled, but it was a sad smile. He said James had graduated and moved to San Francisco, that they kept in touch for a while but eventually drifted apart, that he'd heard through mutual friends that James had found himself there, built a life that honored who he actually was rather than who their small college town had expected him to be. And you? I asked. When did you find yourself? Ellis paused in his work, considering the question. He said it had taken longer than it should have, that he'd spent years in therapy learning to trust his own instincts rather than the stories other people told him about who he was supposed to be. That coming out to himself had been harder than coming out to anyone else, because it meant admitting he'd been performing a version of himself for so long he'd almost forgotten the difference between the performance and the truth. We were standing in his garage area now, where he kept his personal woodworking projects separate from the mentorship program materials. The air smelled of cedar and motor oil and something else I couldn't identify, maybe sawdust, maybe the leather of work gloves, maybe just the particular scent that accumulates in spaces where real work happens. I found myself telling him something I'd never said aloud, barely even thought consciously. That sometimes I wondered what my life would have been like if I'd been different. If I'd been braver, more honest, less committed to meeting other people's expectations. If I'd kissed David that night on the rooftop instead of finding reasons to stay safe. Ellis stopped what he was doing and looked at me directly. His expression was serious but not unkind, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle but certain. Maybe you're not wondering, he said. Maybe you already know. The words hit me like a physical force, like a door slamming open in a room I'd kept locked for decades. Not wondering. Knowing. The distinction felt enormous, the difference between speculation and recognition, between possibility and truth. I stood there in Ellis's garage, surrounded by the tools and materials of his chosen work, and felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. Not breaking, exactly, but rearranging. Like pieces of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for years suddenly clicking into place. The drive home took 25 minutes, but it felt both longer and shorter than usual. Longer because I was acutely aware of every turn, every familiar landmark, every mile that separated me from Ellis and carried me back toward the life I'd built on foundations that suddenly felt less solid. Shorter because I wasn't ready to arrive, wasn't ready to walk through my front door and resume being the version of myself that existed inside those walls. I pulled into our driveway and turned off the engine, but I didn't get out of the car. Instead, I sat there in the darkness, looking at our house with its warm yellow windows and the Christmas decorations Evelyn had put up that weekend. It looked peaceful, settled, like the kind of home people dreamed of having. But for the first time, it also looked like a prison, beautiful and comfortable and impossible to escape. I thought about Evelyn inside, probably reading in bed or planning tomorrow's lessons. About Owen and Fiona, growing up and becoming themselves with the fearless certainty of people who had never learned to hide their true natures. About the man I'd been when I woke up that morning, and the man I was becoming in the space between Ellis's words and whatever came next. Maybe you already know. I did know. That was the terrifying, liberating truth that I could no longer avoid. I knew what had been missing from my life, what I'd been searching for in all those bookstores and solitary walks and moments of staring out windows at lives I couldn't quite imagine living. I knew why dancing with Ellis had felt like coming alive. I knew why his hand on my shoulder had undone something in me that had been wound too tight for too long. I knew why sitting beside Evelyn at dinner or lying next to her at night felt increasingly like playing a role in someone else's story. I sat in my car for over an hour, watching the lights in our house gradually turn off as my family prepared for sleep. When I finally went inside, moving as quietly as possible through the familiar rooms, I felt like I was saying goodbye to something. Not to my family, not to my responsibilities, but to the version of myself that had been content to wonder rather than know, to perform rather than live. In the bathroom, brushing my teeth in the mirror I looked into thousands of times before, I saw something different in my reflection. Not dramatic. Still the same face, the same graying hair, the same lines around my eyes. But there was something new in my expression, something that looked like recognition. Or maybe something that looked like the beginning of courage. The end-of-year celebration for the mentorship program fell on a Friday evening in mid-December, when the early darkness made the community center's windows glow like lanterns against the winter sky. 6 months had passed since that first awkward meeting in November, and now the workshop spaces buzzed with the energy of accomplishment and genuine affection between mentors and students who had become something more than their assigned roles. Marcus stood beside the display table, explaining the restoration of his grandfather's watch to anyone willing to listen. The timepiece sat in a place of honor among the other student projects, furniture pieces, art portfolios, college acceptance letters, and small mechanical repairs that represented months of patient work. But it was Marcus's pride that struck me most, the way he handled the watch with reverence while describing each step of the restoration process, each tiny victory over time and neglect that had brought it back to life. I watched Ellis move through the crowd of students, parents, and community members, accepting congratulations and deflecting credit with the quiet grace I'd come to recognize as a signature way of being in the world. He wore a navy blue sweater I'd never seen before, and his hair was shorter than usual, as if he'd made some effort for this occasion. When our eyes met across the room, he smiled, not the careful professional smile he wore for parents and administrators, but something warmer, more personal, that made my chest tighten with recognition of how much our connection had deepened over these months. The evening proceeded with speeches from the community center director, testimonials from grateful parents, and presentations